This time we're going to have our scripture for our sermon. Would you please stand with me for the reading of God's Word? We'll be looking at John chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason that I was born and came into the world is to testify to truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Humanity seems to have an obsession with kings. We may not always name it as such. We may not always say it's an obsession. We may not always use the term king. But we're obsessed with who has power over us and who doesn't. Who has control and who doesn't. Who has say and whether we have say in the matter. See, we want someone that we can see leading us. We want someone that we can see protecting us, ensuring our safety. Someone that is strong, someone that is steady, someone that could intimidate other people's leaders. We want to have a king. We want to have a leader like that. Now, kings may seem less popular today, or at least from our perspective, because we have no experience of it. But there are 44 nations that have monarchies. We in America may not recognize this as wanting a king or queen. So we put other labels on this desire that we have sometimes. Or we follow other things or groups or personalities that seem to offer those same things, those same securities, those same leaderships, those same ability to intimidate the other people's leaders. We still want those same things that people would want in a monarch. See, there are kings and queens in the world, but is there such a thing as a good leader? Is there such a thing as a good leader? See, I think there's a lot of bad leaders that we do know. According to one website that I looked at, there are dictatorships or authoritarian regimes in 52 countries in the world. There's 3 in Latin and South America, according to this website and their definition, 27 in Asia and the Middle East, and 22 in Africa. Now, some of these countries on that list we can probably guess. From our American mindset, they stick out to us. China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, or Vietnam. We probably would not be surprised to see those countries on that list. But then others may not immediately come to mind for us. Angola, Gabon, Kazakhstan, or Equatorial Guinea, where the president there, Teodoro Mbasogo, has been in power since 1979 when he overthrew his uncle and had him executed. Since then, he has grown his own wealth to over $600 million on the backs of his people. And like many authoritarian rulers, he's known for state-sanctioned kidnapping of people who disagree with him, torture of prisoners, unlawful killings, and people just disappearing. See, it's easy for us to know the bad ones. It's easy for us to know the worst ones. But surely not all human rulers and leaders are like that. I mean, we have laws in place now that prevent rulers from doing stuff like that in most countries. There must be some good people. There must be some good leaders. Well, yes and no. It depends on your definition of good. It depends on what you expect and what you find acceptable in a monarch. Often if we agree with them on this set of things, then we kind of look over this other thing. Or for the other way, if we agree with them on this set of things, then we look over what they're doing over here. Are they leading and loving with eros love, with love that is self-seeking and self-important, that Eros love that seeks to get out of the other person whatever they can? Or are they leading and loving with agape love, where they are giving and putting themselves on the line? See, there are some monarchs that we presume to be good, or at least better. But their possessions and their wealth kind of tell a story as well. King Harald of Norway. Did you know Norway had a king? Anyone here? Well, Norway has a king. King Harald of Norway is known as one of the more humble monarchs that's reigning in the world today. And many monarchs are in what's called a constitutional monarchy, like we see in England, where there is a parliament and a monarch working together. But King Harald of Norway has $30 million estimated. And he costs his country $72.3 million a year in upkeep, in maintaining his properties. He has 9 different mansions spread across the country. Now that sounds like a lot to us, especially if you've never seen $1 million, if you've never seen $100,000, and hearing that this guy has $30 million, it sounds like a lot. The Queen of England has over $500 million and costs close to that amount to her country, maintaining all of her properties, 26 lavish mansions. Now we think of the Queen of England, we think, that's not a bad person. England's our friends, but she's still a human leader. And still falls to the same brokenness that every human leader does. The total wealth of the entire British family is estimated to be around $88 billion. Sometimes to try to find a good king, we make them up. We look to fiction. There's King Richard, who was a real person, but in the tales of Robin Hood, he is made out to be a good king. But still, he left his people to go and fight a crusade, and he taxes people to fund the crusade. Also in English lore, there is King Arthur, who was potentially a real person, but real or not, legends built up around him. And if you look at the characteristics of Arthur, you'll begin to see, if you look at the stories, you'll begin to see that part of what they did in building up these legends is they took what they knew about Jesus. They took Jesus' personality traits, his character, and maybe even some of his holiness, and they mixed that with British ideals at the time, with their morals, with their standing strong to lead and fight against the enemies of Britain. And they combined them into this one person, trying to make a good king that also fulfilled their desires for what they thought a king should be. But also more recently than King Richard and Robin Hood or King Arthur, there's Aragorn. If you hadn't heard of Aragorn, that's okay. He's a character in The Lord of the Rings, which was a series of books written by J.R.R. Tolkien in the mid-1900s. Now, Aragorn was the last remaining heir of a line of kings, the last remaining heir of an ancient king from centuries ago. And this person who he was heir of, he was the high king over all of humanity. And he was king of a city called Gondor. Now, Aragorn grew up in a place of hiding for his own protection and grew up far from Gondor. He, as had his father and his grandfather and others in his line before them. Gondor was, in their absence, ruled by a line of stewards who were meant to rule in the king's place until the king returned, which points to the name of the last book, The Return of the King. See, Aragorn had to find within himself the desire to take on that role because he didn't want it. Part of him really resisted it and wasn't sure about it and didn't want it. And he refused to force his kingship on anybody. He would not be king unless the people wanted him as their king, regardless of his birthright to be that in that role. And still, even with the goodness that we can see in this fictional character, we still see his human flaws. But what was good was he was patient, he was protective, he was providing, he was persistent, and he also had a long beard and long hair. Remind you of anyone? No, I'm not talking about me. I don't have long hair, I barely have hair. It shouldn't, at least not intentionally. See, Aragorn is not the Christ figure of the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings doesn't have one. It's not a Christian allegory. It was never meant to be. Unlike C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which has Aslan, which is intentionally written to be the Christ-like character in that series. And no other character in the Chronicles of Narnia series can be confused for that. No one is going to look at Edmund or Lucy or the beaver and say, well, that is Christ in this story. C.S. Lewis meant that story series to be Christian allegory. But Tolkien didn't. See, in The Lord of the Rings, there are several characters that say and do things that should remind us of Jesus. But this is not because they are the, quote, Jesus of the story, but because the author's Christianity was being expressed through his writing. Now, I'm getting off on a rabbit trail here, but stick with me for a bit. In fact, the most important to our conversation is the part that Aragorn was both not the Christ-like figure of the stories, and was also the kind of king that people would choose for themselves. He was tall, he was strong, he was powerful, he had a beard, he had long hair, which is what the Israelites liked about Saul when they chose Saul. He was tall, he had a beard, and he looked strong. You see, there's a portion of Scripture that tells us about people choosing to have a king, and about the kind of king that they choose. And we can see that in 1 Samuel 8, verses 10 through 20. I'm going to read that for you real quick. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and his attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king that you have chosen. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles." We read that passage and we think how crazy they must have been. We do the same thing. We get this idea of what a king will be like, and we say, I want a king that's going to fight our battles. We want a king that's going to make us just like everybody else. But God gives these warnings. He's going to take your sons and make them work for him. He's going to likewise take your daughters and make them work for him. He's going to take your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, that which is your means of providing for yourself. He will take that which you've stored up to provide for yourself. He will take a portion of your livestock and take your servants who help you live day-to-day life. And you will be his slaves. When you choose a king other than God, you're going to be slaves. There's no other way to twist that or explain that. That's exactly what Samuel says. When you choose a God for yourselves, when you choose a king for yourselves, you will end up slaved. Now we might sit here and think, well, we're lucky we don't have a king. We're in America. We have this representative governments. We're unaccustomed to the idea of king. But we cling just as easily to other humans and human concepts, and we place them on the throne that should be for Jesus alone. We put them on the throne in our lives. And it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a monarch. Anything can be the king in our life if we let it be. News corporations, talking heads on TV, politicians, inspirational voices, our work or our boss at work, co-workers, friends, our spouse. Now I want to pause there. We want to support and encourage healthy, strong, and growing marriages, but sometimes in the name of having peace and passivity, we put our spouse on a throne that does not belong to them in our lives. We can also do this with our kids. Societal rules. And some people even choose themselves as king. Choose to be king over their own lives. There's no higher authority or higher wisdom in their lives than themselves. Some claim that is freedom, but that too is enslavement. It leads to enslavement, to worry and to fear, to constantly being on guard, and scared of who's coming for you, who's standing over you, or who might have any expression that they might have some kind of authority over you and you want to fight back against it. Being king of your own life is enslavement too. So we may not have an actual person that we can point to and say, that is our king. We may live in a democratic republic and have what is designed to be a representative government. But it's interesting that many members of Congress leave office much wealthier than when they first started. On both sides. Still, I'm not just talking about political leaders, but of who and what is the king in your life. We still place things on pedestals and thrones that they do not belong on. We still give glory and deference to created things rather than to the Creator, to whom all honor and glory are owed. So in our passage today, we see Jesus and Pilate having this confrontation, having this discussion. And frankly, Jesus doesn't look like a king in this passage. Or at least he doesn't look like the kind of king that Israel was looking for when they chose Saul. He doesn't look like the kind of king that people were looking for when they were waiting for the Messiah. He doesn't look like the kind of king that we look for in our brokenness. See, Jesus had gone through ridicule. Jesus had gone through a mockery of a trial before this point. And here Pilate is mocking him again. No recognition, nothing. And he has no power through his own submission, but he has no power to just get up and leave. He has no authority by our understanding of authority. And he was about to endure the cross. And before the cross, the whips and lashing, it would tear his skin to shreds. He was practically bleeding to death before he ever made it to Golgotha. But here he says that if his kingdom were of this world, if my kingdom were of this world, then my followers would fight to save me. And my followers would fight to protect me. But it's not about them fighting to save me. It's about me dying to save them. See, I once took that passage, if my followers were of this world, I once took it to say, Jesus saying, like, hey man, if I had my angels here, you'd be in trouble. If I had my angels here, you wouldn't know I hate you. And I was reading it wrong. There's something deeper here. See, he's making a critique on how kingdoms of the world, all kingdoms of the world, work. And pointing out that he is different. That this is different. That what's happening is different. What's happening right before Pilate's eyes is the undoing of Pilate's own empire. Of our own empires. This is how his kingdom works. He's where he's supposed to be. This is what his kingdom does. And this is the kingdom that we're all invited to be part of. This different kingdom. See, if you're looking for a Jesus that will look and act like the kings of the world, then you're either going to be sorely disappointed, or you're going to come up with an idol, which you call by the name Jesus, but which is modeled after your own human perception of a king. So I don't know if you have ever noticed this, but Jesus doesn't make sense. Now wait a second, did a pastor just say Jesus doesn't make sense? Jesus doesn't make sense. Not in the way that we think, not in the way that we're taught to think. He tells us to turn the other cheek. He tells us to love your neighbor. He tells us to put others before yourself. He says the first will be last. See, a king teaching and demanding these things of those who wish to be in his kingdom, who displays these things in their own life, is not the kind of king that we usually want. It's not what we think of as a king. It sounds almost sacrilegious to say it that way, to say that Jesus doesn't fit that model, but he's not meant to. I can find no other way to express the absurdity of Jesus, the backwardness of Jesus, other than to point out that his forwardness is our backwardness, and that's the point of it. Lots of things that he did and said don't make sense. They're confusing. They go against what the world teaches us. And tithing fits directly in with that. Tithing does not make sense. It does not make sense to this world. People look at you and you're like, you do what? You work and earn that money? You take your money And instead of providing for your family, you're giving to a church. You're giving to a kingdom. It doesn't make sense. It's not how the world works. See, I think there's several reasons why people don't tithe. They don't feel it's necessary. They aren't committed enough. They've been putting it off. Fear, worry, apathy. Fear that if I stop trusting in my own provision, that I don't really know if God's going to provide for me. But we've heard several stories in the weeks leading up to this of testimonies of how God does provide. So I'd like to encourage you, when we have those slips ready, starting the first week of Advent, we're having a tithing challenge for you. We're walking alongside you in this journey of faith as an act of worship. And if you're not tithing now, I'm not going to know. I don't look into what's being given. I don't look into the numbers. I don't know. I don't want to know. It's between you and God. But take a slip and say, you know what? I'm going to commit to tithing for these 90 days. Just for 90 days. And if at the end of 90 days you haven't seen God moving in your life, let us know and we'll give it back to you. We will give it back to you. But join with us on this journey of faith. In the passage from Samuel, we're told that when we choose a king other than God in the person of Jesus, that we'll be enslaved. We may not realize it at first, especially depending on what and who we choose for an alternative king. It may be very comfortable to be enslaved there. But Jesus is the true king. Jesus is what a king should be. Jesus as king, God as supreme and only ruler in our lives, is what Israel gave up. It's what we gave up. Sometimes we may give sentimental or verbal commitment, but don't really commit, and someone or something else is truly the king of our lives. In The Lord of the Rings, when a man from Gondor first meets Aragorn, the king that I told you about, and he's told that this man is the rightful king, the man responds by saying, Gondor has no king. Gondor needs no king. And I think sometimes we do that in our own lives too. I have no king. I need no king. Because we don't recognize who we're putting on the throne of our lives. Later, in the moments before this man dies, he has come to recognize his rightful king. He knows that he is not just a cog in the wheel of the king's desires, but that he matters, that he is loved, and the kingdom will be both led and protected. What Jesus asks of us compared to what other leaders may ask of us can show who he is and show that he is a king worth following. Most human leaders, as I said, have at least an element of looking out for themselves, whereas Jesus is all agape love, all self-giving love. Jesus says, I don't require blood or animal sacrifices. I've taken care of that. I've rebuilt the bridge that collapsed into the ravine when you walked away. I don't require that you spend all of your time at church, but I do request that you spend some hours worshiping and serving with your church family each week. But I also ask that all of your time be given to me. No matter how you spend it, that you spend it in my name in ways that will reflect me. I don't require to be the one person that you love exclusively. But I do ask that you love everyone you engage with and everyone that you see deeply and lavishly in my name, so that they might know that through you, of my love for them. I don't require all of your work and labor. But I do ask that everything you do, everything that you work for, be done in my name and in a way that reflects me. I do not require all of your money and all of your resources. But I do ask that you commit to giving 10%, a full tithe, as an expression of trust in my provision and as an act of worship. But I also ask that all of your money, everything you have, be spent in ways that glorifies my name. Friends, Jesus doesn't give us a leash and a collar and say, come and sit by my feet. Jesus alone is a king worth serving, worth acknowledging. And instead, he says, come and sit at my table and let me wash your feet. Any other king, anything else that we acknowledge as king, anything else that has that position in our lives will eventually lead to enslavement. Anything in our lives that competes with Jesus for kingship in every area of our lives, we need to identify and set aside. Our closing song is new here, but some of you may recognize it. Feel free to sing out your praises as we sing together, or read the words and reflect on them, and let them be a prayer for you. Either way, may these words be a prayer of recommitment for you. Recommitment to our God, to our shepherd, to our King. Let's all stand and sing together.